Welcome to the Rocky Mountain AI Interest Group. The following presentation by Dr. Anthony T. Pinter took place on May the 9th at our meeting entitled Creativity, AI Art, and Copyright. For future meetings, check out our meetup group and also our website at RMAIIG.org.
Our first speaker is Dr. Anthony Pinter. He's a teaching assistant professor at the Atlas Institute at CU Boulder. He's very involved in the generative AI club at CU, which I belong to as well. He teaches courses in creative technology and design program on web development, computational thinking, and programming, and also how data represents us, our lives, and the worlds around us. He's going to draw on inspiration from various places like philosophers, writers, and activists. And he's going to speak on creativity in the age of AI and what generative AI could enable us to do as creatives and technologists. Please join me in welcoming Anthony Pinter.
Thanks, Dan. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And before I get fully underway, I just want to do the thing that we have to all do over Zoom, where it's right now I'm looking up here because my face is up here, but the camera's down here. And so if I'm looking in odd places, please excuse me. I put the camera in a place that I think is best, but there's never one best. So as Dan so graciously introduced, my name is Anthony. I'm a teaching assistant professor at the Atlas Institute at CU Boulder. And the title of my kind of 20-minute lightning talk here is Generative AI and the Future of Creativity. And being kind of the good teacher that I am, I like to start everything that I do, whether it's a talk like this, a class meeting, with sort of a roadmap, so you can kind of see where we're going. So here's the roadmap for this talk. I'm going to start with kind of just giving a little more detail about myself and why you should listen to me and give what I say any sort of time of day. I'm going to go over the kind of sub-questions that I'm going to kind of try to address with this talk. And then the three kind of big areas of the talk are Isabel Mej and the question of creating, Wilhelm Flusser and the idea of technical images, and then this idea of new creativity with an example, and I'll close with a concluding thought. So without further ado, I'll dive right in. So who am I and why should you trust me? So like I said, and like Dan said, I'm a teaching assistant professor at the Atlas Institute at CU Boulder. That's just a fancy way of saying that I didn't feel like chasing tenure. And so I rejected that particular career and went down the teaching route. I teach more, but I still do research. I'm still active, both from a research perspective and a creative perspective, as I hope this talk might illustrate. If you don't know, Atlas is an interdisciplinary institute for radical creativity and invention. We're in the engineering college at CU, but we kind of draw from across campus. We have faculty members who sit in the various engineering departments. We have faculty members from the College of Communications, and the College of Music, and the College of Arts. So it's a really kind of exciting place to be, and a place that we feel is the right place for generative AI and those kind of conversations. My PhD is in information science, and my broadest area of research kind of deals with online identity in the wake of life transitions. So this is a little bit different than what I do normally, but something I think a lot about just because I'm ultimately thinking about how data represents the world around us. And I teach courses on web design, computational thinking, and using data to tell stories. And that's all great, but it doesn't really give you any reason to trust me other than I have a privileged position in a large research university, albeit as a teaching faculty member. And so why should you actually really trust me? So I identify my work as being deeply interpretivist and deeply theoretical. I make sense of others' experiences through theoretical lenses and conceptual frameworks. And this current moment with generative AI, and I say current moment, acknowledging that this has actually been a conversation that has exploded into popular consciousness over about the last year, demands sort of interpretation and sense making, and what better way to do that than through some theory and some historical perspectives. And why should you actually trust me? So specifically to my creative practice, as nascent as it is, I think the idea of translating generative AI, be it text to image, image to text, name your generative AI, but translating that into tangible kind of physical forms to be kind of a deeply enthralling practice. The idea of presenting interactions with generative AI and mediums and formats that feel familiar to people until closely examined. I've already done some of this work in Atlas, for instance, creating these Valentine's Day cards that look like they might be Valentine's Day cards that you might find in your homework aisle of your grocery store, but upon closer inspection, have that kind of AI touch, so to speak, if it's a little bit off. So with all that said, I want to pivot now and talk about, what am I doing in this talk? So here's the prompt for the whole meeting this evening. What does it mean to create in the age of generative AI? What's the same and what's different from current practice? Do AI tools mean the end of human creation and art, or simply the dawning of a new chapter of human creativity? And why won't the United States Copyright Office currently register copyright for AI-generated art? You might be able to guess what of these questions I'm going to try and answer and talk about. What does it mean to create in the age of generative AI? Of course, all three of us are hopefully going to speak to that. And of course, what does it mean to create, right? And so the specific question of the three sub-questions is that second one. So do AI tools mean the end of human creation and art, or simply just the dawning of a new era? And I want to be clear before I move on here that I'm well aware of the ethical issues surrounding generative AI art, and indeed kind of LLMs, generative AI, computer vision, etc. I'm truly very deeply aware of those. And I'll point out moments, or at least I'll try to point out moments where I think what I'm saying butts up against those ethical issues. But I'm not going to devote too much time to actually teasing out the ethics of these tools. I think there are way better people out there, even in the Boulder area, for that particular task than me. I'm also hyper aware of the pessimism that kind of surrounds some of these tools and the use of some of these tools. And I'm not immune to that pessimism, but the point of the talk here is to instead focus on the promise that these tools sort of contain. And so for at least the next 10 to 15 minutes and maybe the duration of the panel, I'm going to be the token optimist if there are no others up here on stage. But you might see me acknowledge those potential problems as well. So with that out of the way, to tease out this question of do AI tools mean the end of creativity, or is it just something new? I'm going to talk about three things. So the first is Isabelle Mej, who is a French medical secretary, her 30-year practice as a model. The second, I'm going to talk about the ideas of Wilhelm Flusser, who is a Czech Brazilian media theorist. And then finally, I'm going to argue that what Mej did is synonymous to what we do now with generative AI, and analyze that creation through Flusser's sort of theoretical lens. And I'm going to do this specifically by presenting a project of my own that pays homage to what Mej has done. So right into it. So Isabelle Mej, from 1986 to about 2008, messaged photographers whose work she admired and asked them to make a photo of her. Over the course of these 3 decades, she amassed a collection of over 300 images, and through creation, she constituted what she calls the collection, in scare quotes. And the collection is 135 of the images that were made of her with various photographers. At least within the last year or so, this collection has never been publicly shown. That might have changed somewhat recently. I was seeing some whisperings, but at least right now in this moment, I'm going to claim that it has never been publicly shown. She holds ownership of all of the photos. And Mej's collection of images all depict her body in some format. They're mostly black and white, almost all nude as she preferred to be photographed. And after getting a photographer to agree to take a photo of her, she gave the artist complete control over how to capture her. As part of this sort of photo taking process, she insisted no money be exchanged and that the rights to all the photos be signed over to her, hence why there's never been one cohesive presentation of these photos. into a public space. We have obviously some pictures that I'm showing here, but largely these come from a New Yorker article from about 7 years ago. Mej's work sits in contrast. There's the typo that I always put in everything. With the work of Isabelle Hubert, who did a similar project in 2005, where she had photographers take photos of her as however they wanted. However, Hubert's project was with famous photographers, and Hubert herself is globally known. And so in kind of thinking through, like, what are these two projects doing and how are they the same, how are they different? Henry Foucault said that Hubert is this perfect counterexample to what Mej has done, because you can't make it an artistic endeavor if you're a professional model. There are artists who never got past the fact that they were photographing an actress, and quite famous actress, Isabelle Hubert. Mej, in contrast, was a medical secretary in Paris and later moved to Dijon. In contrast again to Hubert, who holds the record for being the actress with the most films in the Cannes competition. And where Hubert worked with really famous photographers, Mej's collection was a little more eclectic. There were certainly some very famous photographers in her collection of those who have taken a photo of her. But really the kind of core thread through those different artists was that Mej found them to be interesting, or admired their work, or found their work moving. She rarely worked with artists who came to her. It always had to be her to them. And in doing so, she would use some version of the phrase, and I'll apologize in advance, my spoken French is rusty. J'aimerais percevoir à travers votre regard, which you can kind of loosely translate as, I would like to see myself through your gaze, or I'd like to see myself from your perspective. Now, Mej lacked the ability, creative, technical, or otherwise, to create the photos that she was portrayed in. And you see here some examples of the ones that are of her, but are, again, completely in the artist's control. And so atop of her head, or I believe this is actually her elbow or armpit. And in fact, when asked if she herself considered herself an artist, she said, no, I just really wanted to make photos. It was audacious. Really, I was just a person who responded to a feeling I had. Others were willing to follow it too. Another philosopher, a media theorist, Jean-Luc Nancy, argued that understanding Mej's project requires understanding that the act itself makes her into an artist of some sort. And so here he argues that Mej is an artist who distributes the means of creation to others instead of herself. And so she is functionally an artist whose medium is other artists. Mej's work is not auto-portrait, nor is it allo-portrait. So it's not self and it's not other, but rather it's somewhere in between self, other, made. She certainly picked the people to make the photos of her, but then gave them control over exactly what form that photo took. And I'll return to this idea of self, other, made here in a little bit. But first, I want to segue into Wilhelm Flusser. And at the end of this section, the kind of connection between Mej and Flusser hopefully will be made a little more explicit, because right now you're like, we're talking about AI, or are we talking about some French woman who took photos for 30 years? So the second part of this talk about Wilhelm Flusser, I want to talk about the Universe of Technical Images, which is a book from the mid-1980s that Flusser authored. This book questioned the role of creativity, art, and labor in the creation of art, and particularly in film. Keep in mind, this was the mid-1980s. And Flusser lays out the development of cultural history as this sort of ladder. And he does this to differentiate between traditional and technical imagery. So very quickly, I'll blaze through this slide. But the first rung, it's the level of concrete experience. We're sitting and I can feel my chair and I can see the light coming on my left side. The second rung, the level of grasping and shaping, characterized by the stone blades and carved figures of ancient, kind of prehistorical human. The third rung, the level of observation and imagining, characterized by traditional pictures such as cave paintings. Then the fourth rung, the level of understanding and explanation, the historical level. So here's where we see linear texts like the Bible or Homer. And then the fifth rung, which is where we were, at least he claimed we were in the mid-1980s, is where texts are shown to be sort of inaccessible. They collapse into particles that must be gathered up. And this is the level of calculation, computations of technical images. And almost immediately after delineating this model of like, here's how cultural history is developed and here are the rungs of human development, he then goes on and says, here's the difference between traditional and technical images. The first being traditional, are observations of objects, while the second are computations of concepts. The first arise through depiction, the second through a particular hallucinatory power that has lost its faith in the rules. Hopefully at this point, you're starting to see maybe where this is going and thinking, okay, this might be about generative AI, perhaps. Flusha then goes on to distinguish who can create images, right? Traditional images, for example, here, Van Gogh's Other Starry Night, which I think is the better of the two, are created by those privileged creatives who have training and have the innate ability to create something. But again, remember, traditional images are things that represent the world. So this is Van Gogh's representation of A Starry Night over the Rhone. Technical images, however, are created in attempts to consolidate particles around us and in our consciousness into images. This can't be achieved with the hands, nor the eyes, nor the fingers, for these elements are not graspable, nor are they visible. For this reason, apparatus must be developed that grasp the ungraspable, visualize the invisible, and conceptualize the inconceivable. So here we have what I prompted a mid-journey, which was Van Gogh's Starry Night on the Rhone. And we can see it's close, but not quite exact. It's added a ship in the foreground where there are people in the original. Flusser goes on to talk about these apparatus as must be fitted with keys so that we may manipulate them, and they are essential for the production of technical images. Now again, Flusser's in the 1980s, computers weren't as robust as they are now. So he's really talking a lot about cameras, about film and photography. But the arguments here, I think, very clearly can map onto generative AI, right? Apparatus being a computer that we key in some prompt and get something out with. And in the case of generative AI specifically, things that we could not have imagined possible before. Apparatuses are controlled by envisioners, those people who press the keys to make it stop at an intentionally informative situation. People determined to control the apparatus in spite of its tendency to become more and more automated and so preserve the sense of judgment over the machine. Another take on the Starry Night over the Rhone. To envision here is to step from the particle universe back to the concrete with something that is not a mirror, but rather a projection. Technical images do not show us their meaning. They show us a way in which we may be directed. And so I ask as a kind of provocative question here is, in the age of generative AI, are we not all envisioners looking not at the past, but at the future, looking not for meaning, but direction, making things that are representations of some possible reality instead of our concrete reality? And here's where I'll return back to MEIIG. So reading MEIIG through this idea of there are apparatus that we key something into and get some possibility out of. Nancy's characterization of her as an artist whose medium was other artists is instead that MEIIG is a type of envisioner, maybe a more analog type. And Flusser kind of handles this idea. The apparatus does as the photographer desires, but the photographer can only desire what the apparatus can do. So we see here kind of the interplay between human and apparatus, or in MEIIG's case, MEIIG and her photographer at that moment. She queried apparatuses, photographers. She allowed those photographers to do what they would after her initial query. And so here I'm going to make the statement that I think creation is still there, but it might shift ever so slightly in the age of generative AI. To go from being creative or to create to instead envision and then curate using generative AI as part of the process of creating ultimately. Querying a generative AI is envisioning an outcome, sifting through infinite outcomes, possibilities of the envisioning and coming to a curated, finite, desired conclusion. It represents this new form of creativity. So not the death of, but rather an extension of creativity. And this brings me to the final point, which I haven't gotten a wave yet, so I think I still have time, which is fantastic. Where I'll talk about just a project that I've not presented publicly, but that I hope to at some point in the future, and it is sort of directly inspired by MEAIIG. And here's where I'll purposely remind you that I wouldn't yet identify as an artist, at least at first, with the hope to underscore the point that we can all be envisioners and curators in the age of generative AI, and that it does represent this new form of creativity. So when MEAIIG asked photographers to capture her through their perspective, she was doing so with the expectation that they would use a particular kind of medium, photography. Her act of curating who was allowed to create that representation of her made her an artist, if we believe Jean-Luc Nancy. And the self-other-made portrait, where the self has agency and creation as much as the other does, MEAIIG is a good example of this. So what I did was I made self-other-mades through the medium of generative AI. And again, just as a sort of callback, the apparatus that allows one to key an input and receive infinite possibilities out. And calling back to Flusser, as I run my fingertips selectively over the typewriter to achieve this text, I achieve a miracle. And so I asked Midjourney to show me what I looked like from its perspective. And I did this by starting with sort of a base description of myself, which was a man with short buzz-cut blonde hair and short beard wearing glasses. And then on the end of this, I appended various styles. So that prompt, and then at the end, in the style of Matisse. I also, after playing around with this a little bit, because I ended up using these as headshots, because I have no good pictures of myself, also adjusted the aspect ratio to make it taller than wider, because that works a little bit better on my website and in most sort of situations where you need a headshot. I upscale a few, and here are some representations of me that you would find on my website and in various other places, including, not uncoincidentally, my Zoom picture. I took this a step further, right? This is sort of interesting of its own, but I took this a bit further. I asked some colleagues a riff on MEAIIG. J'aimerais percevoir à travers votre regard algorithmique. I read it better than I speak it, believe me. But what did I do? Well, I installed Midjourney onto a Discord server of my own, and I gave a severely pared down version of this talk to some friends and some colleagues, and I asked them to query me. I wanted to see how they saw me through the algorithm's lens. Naturally, the prompts differed. I'll pause here just for a second to let everybody look and pick out a particular one that they think is very interesting. And of course, these people know me. They've been my colleagues for 5 or 6 years. So they all know, of course, that I have a bunch of tattoos that you can't see right now because the headshot view. They know that I ride bikes and that I ski and that I have particular tastes in music. But you could still see sort of the base descriptors of me, tall, blonde, blue-eyed, bearded man. And the output of this was a whole bunch of different views of me. What do I look like filtered through the algorithm's lens? And particularly, what would I look like if I was a kindergarten crayon hand turkey? Because we happened to do this right before Thanksgiving, and that was our sort of amusement for the day, was to call back to kindergarten and draw hand turkeys. So I have a number of places I want to go with this project. Photo booth-like installations. Think of it as a photo booth to an alternate reality. Again, going back to my idea of making tangible that which is not tangible, I think printing or painting and then framing these outputs would make for a very interesting project. And of course, performance pieces around querying and displaying that output to spectators, much in the way that I did with my lab group here at CU. But to conclude out here, and I still haven't gotten the wave, so I'm assuming I'm under time, which again, thrilled. The question I started this lightning talk with, as a reminder, was, do AI tools mean the end of human creation and art, or simply the dawning of a new chapter of human creativity? And I think to succinctly answer that question, And in closing, I'll give one last quote from Flusser, because I think he kind of had this figured out 30 years in advance. Future images will be art at a high level because they will owe their production to the dialectic between the theory embedded in the apparatus and the intuitive hallucinatory power of the envisioner or envisioners. Generative AI will allow everybody to be creators, in so much that they're actually envisioners and curators, going to the universe of technical images and returning with one of those infinite possible outcomes that they've deemed best. I would say art and creativity isn't dead, it's just changing as it always has in response to technical innovation. And with that, I will turn it back over. Thank you so much.